Welcome back to Please Explain, David and Eric.
Great to be back in Canberra, Rachel, and great to be talking with you again, Eric.
Great to be here with you guys.
This is the first time an Australian Prime Minister has had an official visit in China with President Xi Jinping since 2016, after relations between our countries deteriorated in the lead up to the pandemic, and then they entered a deep freeze. Eric, how did this go?
Well, I think the first thing to say is what a spectacle. I mean, the Chinese really laid it on for Anthony Albanese, meetings in the Great Hall of the People, People's Liberation Army, military guard, all the grandeur, I guess, of the Chinese state that we've come to expect was on show. And I think the overall message was one of really overwhelming positivity, certainly from the Australian delegation. I think they came back pretty happy with how it went. But it's also safe to say that perhaps some of the more difficult questions in the relationship weren't really raised as publicly as we might expect. And the challenges in the relationship, despite the really rosy outcomes and pictures from Beijing, do still remain.
We talked before you both travelled to China last week, and David, you were saying that this trip was largely symbolic. The Prime Minister wasn't going with hopes of gaining anything concrete like the resumption of the lobster trade, for instance, after that stalled in 2020. So what progress was made?
There was significant progress made at the symbolic level, and I do think now that it's all over, we can see that there was some real advance made at a deeper level on trade. I was a bit wary about what progress there might be, but I was actually surprised by the effusiveness of the Chinese welcome. And that's, Eric has mentioned that, and it really struck us when we were there. The Chinese leaders talking about a new starting point in the relationship. The Chinese President Xi Jinping telling Anthony Albanese, how heartened he was by the improvement in ties since the election last year. And of course, then we had the Chinese Premier, Li Qiang, saying that the social media in China had all remarked upon the fact that Anthony Albanese was a handsome boy. Now, set aside how that Chinese phrase was translated, it could mean handsome man, not just handsome boy. There's a bit of a debate about that. The point was that they were laying it on pretty thick, and thicker than I was expecting. And the symbolic nature of that actually does matter. It matters to Chinese businesses in China who can now see that there's a warmth in the relationship so they can do business with Australian exporters with greater confidence. That really matters. It sends a message to Chinese people in Australia about the relationship as well, and it gets things back on a more balanced footing. After the talks, there was clearly a sense on the Australian side that it's only a matter of time before the remaining trade barriers are eased. Now, we don't know that for sure, but there's great confidence about that. The trade sanctions from the Chinese side have been on $20 billion worth of Australian exports. That's now fallen to about $2 billion worth of exports. Wine, seafood like lobsters, and some beef from some abattoirs in Australia. Clearly, all the Australians came out of these talks thinking that it's only a matter of time before the lobster curbs are removed. That's about 750 million just there. And in the coming months, the wine barriers will be removed. So that's a good outcome. But we're only talking really about the trade relationship here. There was no sense in these talks that China got any outcome from Australia on a strategic level. We're still going ahead with the AUKUS submarine agreement with the UK and the United States. There's no change in the Australian position on the South China Sea, where we object to, or where we insist upon the rule of law in territorial disputes. And there's no clear signal from Anthony Albanese that he's supporting China on what it wants on a regional trade bloc, which has got a very long name, but basically in shorthand is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. China wants membership of that. We're not saying yes. I think we're still more aligned with Japan on that sort of fundamental question. So that's where things are at the end of this, a big week. A very good symbolic meeting without dramatic movement on strategic differences in the relationship.
So you've both said that these Chinese leaders laid out the red carpet, both literally and figuratively, it sounds like. Eric, I'm interested to know how the visit has been portrayed by Chinese media, and what do you think that means for relations between the countries going forward?
Well, they've turned on a dime. It was only last year that Chinese state media was threatening Australia with missiles for the AUKUS Security Pact. We saw on Monday and Tuesday, we saw pretty comprehensive coverage, for example, in the China Daily and the People's Daily, and right across Chinese social media of the importance of the visit. Now, usually you don't pay too much attention to what other media is doing, but in China, it's actually a way of ventilating how the government wants to frame the relationship, because, of course, it is all controlled by the government. So the positive sentiment there is undeniable. The risk, I think, becomes that people become complacent about that new narrative. And just as we have seen before with China, it can easily flip back. And that challenge of navigating what can be very turbulent waters in Chinese public diplomacy is something that Anthony Albanese now has to manage and has been managing. But with a new narrative in place now, the tricky part is going to be raising difficult questions like human rights, like Yang Hengjun, like China's actions in the South China Sea, whilst keeping that dialogue open and that overall framing of kind of a new stabilization in the relationship. One of the interesting comments that I heard from a pretty senior Chinese academic was that, Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese talk about cooperating where we can and disagreeing where we must. And he said, well, that's pretty much exactly how China views the situation. So there's been a really clever discourse framing from the Australian side that has now in some ways been adopted by the Chinese side. And people have come to this kind of new landing point. It's a really bureaucratic and diplomatic term, but it's probably fair to say they have arrived there. It's just taken a very long time and $20 billion in trade strikes and a few detained Australians to get there.
Now, a really interesting aspect of this visit, Eric, is the fact that you were able to attend. You became our China correspondent in 2019, but this is only the second time you've entered China, right?
Second time as a correspondent, that's right. We went in for about a month during the Winter Olympics last year. It's a real challenge covering China remotely. Really what it's made us do is circumnavigate China's borders in many ways and go to many places we probably otherwise wouldn't. But there is definitely a bit of a shift happening there. The Premier Li Qiang actually mentioned journalists very surprisingly and hoped that there would be objective and fair reports on China during the visit. Of course, some of us kind of smirked at that and wondered, well, we've been trying to do objective and fair reports for the past 3 years, but you haven't let us into the country. So perhaps momentum is there for a change. This is the first time that what are called J2 visas have been approved, which is short-term visas to China. Certainly, we made it clear to the Chinese delegation that we hoped there'd be movement on the permanent visas for Australian correspondents. So, I'm optimistic that perhaps we might see that change sometime over the next year or so. But as with all things in China, it requires a great deal of patience and a hell of a lot of bureaucratic wrangling.
I know it's a slightly separate issue, but it was only last month that Cheng Lei, an Australian journalist working for Chinese media, was released from prison. This was also your first visit to China for some time, David, and I'm keen to get both your thoughts about what this says about the future of reporting in China.
Well, it was a very positive thing that we were there at all. There were a couple of journalists, including our colleague Matt Knott, who went into China late last year when Penny Wong visited. That was really a test of a senior Australian figure visiting China again, with a couple of journalists on the plane. So there's been a steady improvement. This is another sign of that. I found that there was not as much direct surveillance of us as journalists as I was expecting. I didn't find that we were being conspicuously watched by security personnel at all times. In Shanghai, I went out walking with one of the photographers, and we had a great walk along the Bund with a lot of Chinese people out enjoying I think it was Saturday night, I can't quite remember, beautiful evening. Of course, at the same time, you're totally aware of the police posts all along the Bund and the surveillance cameras it seemed like every couple of metres, maybe every 10 or 15 metres, another post with surveillance cameras watching everybody. And you know as a reporter that you've gone into China giving them an image of yourself, a photograph of your face that they can then use for biometric purposes to track you if they choose. So we didn't find that it was conspicuous. The last time I was in China was a G20 meeting in 2016, where every time Australian reporters were filming on the streets, there was an obvious security person from the Chinese side within earshot, scooping up every little bit of information and watching everything that they said. We were more careful with our movements this time because the advice was be cautious. We're definitely not back to the old ways with media coverage of China, inside China, and maybe we'll never get there. But we were at least able to be on the ground under very tight time frames, a visa that only lasted for a week or so. But that's a good sign, and now our mission is to build on that so that we can once more get back into China and report from China with confidence.
I think the distinction might also be that we were there reporting on official events, and as far as China is concerned, they want those images to be as positive as they can. So they've kind of got a bit of a looser approach to managing foreign media on those kind of delegation trips. But I'll just give you two anecdotes. When I went down to interview some locals, some Chinese locals in Shanghai and in Beijing, often the response to any question about the Chinese economy or Chinese government would be, that I believe in the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government knows the right thing to do. I believe they will do things that are right. And that was kind of your stock standard response from members of the public who were clearly concerned about saying anything that might put them at risk by saying any kind of negative comments. One of our colleagues in China, Stephen McDonnell, a former ABC correspondent, now works for the BBC, the week before we arrived in China, he went down to Anhui, which is where Chinese Premier Li Keqiang was from. There were big scenes of mourning there. And as Stephen was talking to people on the street who were mourning the Chinese Premier, he's followed around. There's all of a sudden more and more people are kind of crowding around him. Eventually, he talks to an older lady in a wheelchair about how she feels about the Chinese Premier dying, only for some large men to come along and start wheeling her down the street before bundling her into a taxi to get her away from the foreign media. So it depends where you are and what you're covering, very much so in the Chinese context.
Well, thanks so much for joining us again, Eric.
Great to be with you guys.
David, the China visit is over, but the Prime Minister is not back in Canberra yet. He headed straight from that visit to the Cook Islands for the Pacific Islands Forum. The Prime Ministers of the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, New Zealand and Vanuatu aren't attending this meeting. So why is Albanese there?
Well, he's got to be there. I don't think there shouldn't be any question about the importance of going to the Pacific Island Forum. We neglect the Pacific at our risk. And that's totally linked to the China story over the last decade, where we've taken neighbours for granted, and that's led to some huge geopolitical problems for us, including in the Solomons, where China has basically strengthened that relationship to the point where they clearly have port access that's got all kinds of military implications. So it's really important for Anthony Albanese to be there, and it's part of a diplomatic charm offensive, really, that goes back to or is connected with his visit to Washington, D.C. just recently. In the agreement with US President Joe Biden in Washington, the two leaders agreed on more investment in the Pacific. So they've got a big message to the Pacific Island Forum here on Australian cooperation on things like communication lines, undersea cables, mobile phone networks, investment in ports. Clearly, you can see this in the context of strategic competition with China, but Australia is not making any bones about that. We're direct in saying there's strategic competition in the region, and so we have to play a stronger role with the Pacific Islands Forum. And clearly, climate change is also another major issue. It's a top concern among those Pacific leaders. They expect Australia to play its part in addressing climate change, and that's hugely important for Anthony Albanese because his stated position is that we want to host a future United Nations climate summit in the future. We're not going to be able to do that if the Pacific Islands leaders see us as a laggard on climate change. So there's a couple of messages there that he's got to communicate and issues that he's got to negotiate with those leaders.
It's clearly an important meeting, but at home earlier this week, the Reserve Bank raised interest rates for the first time in 5 months. They've taken the official cash rate to 4.35%, and some major banks have already passed that on to their customers. The coalition has spent, the last few days calling for more government action as households, really are feeling the pinch. So what are the optics of the Prime Minister not being in the country at this time, and how will that play out politically?
I think it's challenging for him. I think it probably plays out in a negative way, even though his message is, while he's travelling, that he's in China, for instance, to help build up trade and to help jobs at home. In fact, in China he was very much aware of this domestic issue because he made a point in one of his press conferences that in recent times the government has been able to expand trade with China by $6 billion. So he's putting a dollar value on the benefit from his visit to China. But it's very challenging because he comes back from the Pacific Islands on the weekend. He does a couple of days of Parliament. Then he's got to fly away again. He's got to go to an Asia-Pacific Economic Community meeting in San Francisco. Now, there's a lot at stake in that meeting. He's got to meet regional neighbours, leaders from Asia. At that meeting as well, President Xi from China is meeting President Biden from the United States, and there's a lot riding on those two superpowers getting along. But this is going to make it, I think, doubly hard for Anthony Albanese to assure people at home that they've got an answer on interest rate increases and on inflation. And I do think that we are now seeing a heightened debate about whether federal economic settings are actually doing enough to address inflation. There's going to be a much closer look at whether federal spending is pushing up demand in a way that isn't helpful and adding to the pressure that then leads the RBA to increase interest rates. And that becomes a very difficult issue for the government to navigate. And we have seen, I think partly as a result of the Voice debate, some easing in support for Labor and for Anthony Albanese as Prime Minister. And so I think it's going to become quite a challenging time as we go into the end of the year.
Something the government seems to be doing to try to address these issues is they've started talking about the tough decisions that will be needed on road and rail projects around the country. State and territory projects, federal projects, with costs blowing out and adding to inflation. How will that help its argument that it's working to get inflation down?
I think it's going to be very measured in how it pours money into billion-dollar projects. I think there's a reasonable argument or there's a reasonable question about whether federal and state governments have been pouring too much money too fast into some of these major projects. And so there are question marks about how much can be built and the time frame in which it can be built. That's important because we're seeing cost blowouts or recalculations of the money required for some projects to be built. We're also seeing timeframes changed because everybody admits it's going to take longer to get them built. And so that's why the federal government went to the May budget with a plan to sort of reassess what it was doing on funding a lot of these big projects. And we still haven't got a clear answer from them about which ones are going to be built over which timeframes and which ones are going to have to be put on a go slow because they can't be done. I think clarity on that is still yet to emerge. And it does go to the heart of the wider debate that the government's got at the moment about congestion, about immigration too, population, and the sense in a lot of the big cities that people are under household cost pressures. At the same time, they're dealing with big commute times, the cost of tolls on their freeways. Having an answer on that is going to be an emerging challenge for Anthony Albanese and the government, I think.
Finally, David, former Prime Minister Scott Morrison and former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson travelled to Israel recently, touring a kibbutz in bulletproof vests. What was that about?
That's about an absolute clarity from the conservative side of politics in showing support for Israel when everybody can see that it's a very vexed issue for Labor. We can see that Peter Dutton, as opposition leader, is much more heavily critical of the Palestinian side in this conflict compared to some on the Labor side. We're seeing this emerge as the pattern. I think Scott Morrison, being a relatively free agent, was able to go into Israel and show that support. But I don't think it's just about Scott Morrison doing it. I think we're seeing a dynamic that does become challenging for Labor because it's got people on its own side who see the death of innocent civilians in Gaza and make the entirely valid point that this war should not be about killing children who are not to blame for the Hamas terrorist attack on Israeli civilians only weeks ago. Finding the right rhetoric here is becoming incredibly difficult for people on the Labor side. But I think it's important to note that the idea of a humanitarian pause in the conflict is not something that's just the position of people on the left in politics in Australia. It was a stated position of foreign ministers at a meeting in Tokyo just yesterday. This is the G7 foreign ministers, hosted by the Foreign Minister of Japan, with Antony Blinken there as Secretary of State from the United States. And their position was that there's a case here for a humanitarian pause. So we are seeing it being, incredibly difficult for people to navigate the awful situation in Israel and Gaza at the moment.
David, thanks so much for joining me again.
Thanks, Rachel.